I'm Tupelo Tom,
And I'm Big Lou.
and
And we're
we're
talking.
talking.
So Tom, I told you about how I got into Elvis and everybody has their how they got into Elvis story. What is yours? Besides being from Tupelo.
Well, besides, it's pretty much all of it. I moved to Tupelo with my parents. They did the driving when I was 3. My dad was an Air Force recruiter, and this was his next station. I was born in Roswell, New Mexico, at Walker Air Force Base. So
That explains a lot.
it does explain a lot. That's what people say. In the same hospital where Demi Moore and John Denver were born, actually.
Hmm.
So I have that in common. But moved to Tupelo when I was 3, and from kindergarten through most of my young years, I went to the schools that Elvis went to. My kindergarten was at Lawhorn, which is where Elvis went to grade school. So Elvis was just kind of. I say Elvis is kind of like that brother on the first season of Happy Days. He was there, and then the second season they just never talked about him again. But
Yeah.
you knew he was out there somewhere.
Yeah.
Elvis was kind of always just a part of the town. And again, this is the 60s. I'm in first grade in 1966, 65, 66. So Elvis is making movies. And I knew he was from there. I mean, the birthplace was right there. There were signs everywhere, birthplace of Elvis. And I'm an only child. So he was an older brother that felt like family, that voice, because you're an only child. I had a lot of time to listen to records.
Well, Tom, let me ask you this. You went to that school that he went to, and it's over there behind is it Johnny's, right?
But yeah, behind Johnny's, right? Yeah.
Was there a presence of Elvis there? Did they talk about, oh, this is where Elvis's room was? This is the desk he said. Was any of that going on?
It was, I mean, kindergarten, no, but fifth grade, by fifth grade, yes, it was, because I went to fifth grade there. It was very much talked about that was the stage. And now I'm a little older, I'm in fifth grade. And yeah, it was talked about then. And the
Wow.
birthplace was going, and there's just a lot of talk about Elvis. And then then my seventh and eighth grade was Milam, which is and I distinctly remember at Milam, as a joke, you would get issued, state textbooks, and you had to write your name in the front, and there was a big bunch of blocks. There were people that had it before you, and I would always go back like 7 or 8 people and erase that name, and then write Elvis Presley, and then rub it out a little bit where it looked worn. I said, "Hey, look, I've got Elvis's math book," even though like the book had been published in 1961 or something, just as a joke. So Elvis was just that older brother that was just kind of part of my life, that was always here. And I'd go to the movies, to the Lyric Theater, and see new movies with Elvis. I remember seeing Live a Little, Love a Little new when it was in theaters, and I was buying Elvis records when I was little. Um, I distinctly remember buying "That's the Way It Is" in 1970 when I was 10,
Mm,
with birthday money.
wow.
So and my birthday's 3 days before Elvis's, so I always used to have birthday cakes that you used to always say "Happy Birthday, Tommy and Elvis." So he was just always here. He was just part of the city here, and always there. And among a city full of Elvis fans, it's interesting. You'd think Tupelo at the time would be full of Elvis fans, but there were a lot of people here that still remembered him and remembered his family. So they knew him. It was not fan. They knew him,
Wow.
because it had only been 10, 15 years that he had been
Yeah.
gone.
Yeah. Where did you buy the record at in Tupelo?
There was a record store on West Main, over by it's a church now, but the Malco Theater, where I ended up working as a teenager. I've only had 2 jobs. I worked at a movie theater, and I've worked in television and radio, and that's pretty much it. Uh,
Wow.
but there was a record store that I used to go to that's no longer there. That's a jewelry store now, and the lady that ran it knew I was an Elvis fan, and so I would keep up reading in a music magazine at the library, because that's how you had to. It's a big building with books inside, and they'd let you take them home. But they got Billboard magazine at the library, and I would go to the library and keep up with when Elvis had a record coming out, either an album or 45, and he churned them out pretty quickly. Throughout the year, there's a lot of product
Yeah.
that I was mowing yards for, and she would keep a picture cover for me of a 45. Like, she would maybe get 7 or 8 copies of a 45. Most of them had the hole where you could see the label, but 1 or 2 would be the picture sleeve, which was the full photo of Elvis, and down at the bottom it would say, from the album Aloha from Hawaii or whatever, pushing the next product. Again, a Colonel Parker thing, always promoting the next product on the product you just bought. And she would always hang on to a picture sleeve for me, and I would go ride my bike over and pick it up and come home and play the record or play the and I would get the Elvis albums, and I would always put the receipts inside from when I bought them, because I knew that was going to be important in my museum one day, because I saved everything in anticipation of there being a museum. uh, but my dad always used to say, son, the sign says Tupelo, birthplace of Elvis. It's never going to say, and Tom Brown lived here too. He said, you need to tell people you're from Verona, which is like a little town next door to Tupelo. I could own Verona, but I'm from Tupelo.
Tom Brown can be the Verona sign. Tom Brown lived here.
That's right. Yeah. But one time, as a gift, the people at the birthplace did give me a big green highway sign that says Tupelo, Mississippi, home of Tom Brown.
That's great.
They did. The birthplace did give me a big sign about that. So I would buy the records when they came out. So when you're saying you listened to Old Time's Sake in '77, I bought it when it came out in '73.
Wow.
And I saw Elvis in concert in Memphis at the Mid-South Coliseum in March of '74, which was the concert recorded live for the album Elvis is recorded live on stage at the Mid-South Coliseum, which the cover is the front of Graceland.
So we have these stories when we were younger. You have probably the coolest when I was a kid I saw story, and that's when you were in Memphis at the gates and Elvis is pulling out of Graceland, and you got a picture to prove it.
Yeah, well, and it's something I used to do even before that day. Growing up in Tupelo, my mom was good friends with Janelle McComb, who was a lady here in town that I knew at the time was friends with Elvis, and was instrumental in getting the birthplace open as a visitor site and um, a museum, and just in honoring Elvis. And she was the one that asked Elvis in the mid '70s, what can we do in Tupelo to help honor you? And he said, I wish the fans had a place uh, to go to meditate like I do outside by the pool. If you do anything, you should build that. And so there's a meditation chapel. There's a chapel on the property of the birthplace that was here, and I'm not talking about the church, the First Assembly of God Church, that's also here, that they just recently moved in the last 5 or 6 years onto the property of the birthplace. But a chapel that you go into, it's very small, and the way it's positioned is when you look up at the altar behind it out the window, you see the birthplace. He just wanted a place for fans to be able to go into to get in a quiet place.
Hmm.
So anyway, Ms. McComb was a friend of my mom, and I would see her at the house all the time. They'd be all sitting in the kitchen smoking, and and I would come through, and I didn't ever want to bother her. I never wanted to ask for anything from her, um, because I wanted to hear stories she had to tell about, I went to Memphis and I saw Elvis, and I would always see her and I'd say, hey, Ms. McComb, just tell Elvis Tommy said hey, because I'm still Tommy in Tupelo. And one time I said, hey, Ms. McComb, I was going outside to do something, and I said, hey, be sure to tell Elvis Tommy said hey. And she said, hey, I've got something for you. And I said, oh, okay. And it was an envelope, and inside the envelope, it was a picture of Elvis, like a promotional picture of Elvis that's kind of a painting in a white. It's in the white I Got Lucky jumpsuit, and it's got a printed on Sincerely Elvis autograph on it. And that's what I saw. And I thought, oh, well, this is cool. On the back of it is a big thing about the world's largest teddy bear. It's just a promotional photo. But written in pen down the leg from the printed on thing, it said, to Tommy, best wishes, Elvis Presley.
Wow.
And I was like, and she goes, and that's not all I got you. And I'm like, I'm stunned. I'm 11, 12. And she handed me a red scarf that she said he came off stage and was in the limo with her at a concert and took it off and said, hey, give this to that boy in Tupelo. So okay. And I still have that. And when you're 11 or 12 years old, yes, I thumbtacked that photo up on the wall. It's got like thumbtack holes in it. because you didn't handle stuff with white gloves because,
Mhm.
you're 11 and you're,
Right.
and you're hanging it up. And I took it into school and showed everybody. I mean, it was one of those kind of things. Now I've got it in glass and it's up on the wall, but it's lived in. And then one time she came when I was 14 and she said, "Hey, I've got you tickets to see Elvis in concert." And he was doing several shows at the Mid-South Coliseum, and the tickets that she got us, I think it was on a Wednesday night or Tuesday night. It was a school night, and he had been doing matinees on Saturday and Sunday and weekend shows. And my mom is like, "Couldn't you get us the tickets for the weekend?" And I'm just thinking, "Be quiet." And she said, "No, well, the reason I got you these tickets is because this is the show they're recording to be on an album, and
Mm.
you want to be at this show."
Yeah.
And so the weekend prior, my mom was going to Memphis shopping, and she would go to Memphis like every couple of months shopping, and she would drop me off. It was a different time. She would drop me off at the gate of Graceland, and I would hang out there while she went to Goldsmiths to shop. And I got to know Uncle Vester. There were always people hanging around, but I would just hang there and I'd talk to Uncle Vester, and he knew I was the kid from Tupelo, and I talked to him. And so that weekend that he's doing a matinee before the show that they're going to record, my mom drops me off, and there's a group of people there, and I figure I'll hang out here. Maybe I'll see him leave or something. And sure enough, I'm over looking at the gate. I'm on the right hand side, outside by the hinge of the gate next to the guard shack. And Uncle Vester says, "Hey Tommy, get back now. I got to open the gate. They're coming down." And a couple of cars came down, and then a black limo came down with like a long stretch limo with a lot of people inside. And I could look in and I could see Joe and I could see Linda and I could see Elvis on the other side, on the passenger side in the back seat. And I was like, "Oh, he's on the other side." But I was waving and screaming, and everybody was waving and screaming. And he left, and Uncle Vester said, "Oh, you got to see him." And because this is the first time I'd seen him, I would go hang out at the gate. He wasn't even there, but I didn't care.
Wow.
And and Uncle Vester says, he's on his way to the Coliseum. The show's an hour. He'll be back in an hour, and he always sits in the same place. So if you stay right there, he'll be right next to you when he comes back because he'll be on that side. And I said, "I'm not moving." And I guess an hour passed, and an hour passed, and Uncle Vester says, "Okay, you guys get back." And I'm opening the gate, and everybody got back, and the limo came and slowed down as it went up because there's a lot of people around there. Limo's going slow up through the gate, and Elvis is 2 feet away from me, and all I remember is black hair, black sideburn, purple sunglasses, and a hand in that Elvis pose waving, looking at me through that side window on the limo, looking right up at me, and I'm looking at him and I'm waving and he's waving, and he slowly just went on up the hill, and my mom came and picked me up, and people asked me like, "Did you get a picture?" And I'm like, "Nope, but I only need a picture to prove it to you. If I
Right.
want to see that, I just close my eyes and I can see it exactly." Now, I
Wow.
told that story a couple of times on stage at Graceland, and somebody went into the archives of the either the Memphis Commercial Appeal or the Press Scimitar. Memphis had two newspapers at the time, a morning paper and an afternoon paper, and somebody found a photo of Elvis leaving Graceland for that matinee, and it's a crowd of people, much more people than I remember there, but it's the car leaving for that matinee, and I posted it on my Facebook page, and I just put a big red arrow down to the shadowy figure that's over by the gate because I'm not in the front of the photo because I was holding position, over there by the gate,
Yeah.
the hinge of the gate. So that's my picture with Elvis is he's in the limo on the other side and I'm this little shadowy figure by the gate. But he was a real person and he lived right there and he just was up the road. And when you're going to school in Tupelo, and I knew I was going to be on TV or radio. I knew it from it's the only thing I ever wanted to do even before I saw Johnny Carson. I knew that's what I was going to do. I was going to be on TV or the radio. And I'm not an inherently social person. I'm not an outgoing person, but I just loved the thought of being on TV or the radio, and they didn't offer that in school, so I was going to have to figure out how to do that. But growing up in Tupelo, I knew it would happen because look what this guy did.
Mm.
I mean, when you're growing up in a small town in Mississippi and you're thinking, "What in the world am I going to do?" Oh, wait a minute. I can do anything. Look what he did.
Wow.
Pretty good example for kids in Tupelo especially.
That's incredible.
Well, it's an interesting thing for me because, like I said, being from Tupelo and having that, so I go into television and end up in doing radio and TV and become an entertainment reporter and uh, I majored in theater and broadcasting because I figured they didn't offer the Johnny Carson as a major, but I figured if I did both of those things, I could figure it out from there. And I had a great advisor who at Ole Miss who helped me decide what to do with my career. She's like, "Son, you're not going to be an actor, so you need to learn everything about acting so you can act like you know what you're doing when you're doing other stuff in your life." So it came in handy. And like I said, I'm not an outgoing social butterfly kind of person, so it's in I can turn it on when I have to, but I'm really not. And doing all these things and these jobs, it brought me to I started working in Tupelo at my local TV station. The I started TV the night I took the last test at Ole Miss when I was 22, and that was in 1982. So in December of 2022, it was 40 years in broadcasting. That was 40 years of doing TV and radio.
Wow.
And it's great because my dad was in the military and he said, "Son, if you find something you love doing like I do, you'll never go to work a day in your life." And that's kind of how it's been. It's been a lot of fun. So anyway, my career takes me to I'm in Shreveport for a couple of years. I'm in St. Louis for about 10 years. I go to LA for a couple of years working on a national show for TNT, entertainment reporter, and I specialized kind of in stories about old Hollywood. I got to go to Rod Steiger's house and hang out with him for a day and met
Wow.
met Tony Curtis and all these people. Tony became a friend, but that's a separate entire episode of the podcast. And our show got canceled, and I'm like, oh no, now I'm out of work in Los Angeles. And I always knew I was going to end up in LA. I used to have a map of Los Angeles on my bedroom wall when I was a kid in grade school, learning how to get around in LA because I knew I'm going to live here. I need to know where the streets are. I knew how to drive around in LA before I ever got there.
Incredible.
And yeah, and in LA with a show that's just gotten canceled, what am I going to do? And the big man from Turner came to tell everybody they were let go. And he said, "Hey, I've got a position open at Turner Classic Movies running the production department and I was my own producer on my stories, so I knew how to put together, you know, video pieces." And he said, "Would you consider coming to Atlanta? And I think you'd be perfect for this job because your first love in movies is classic Hollywood." And again, there's that just ready to go. TV production. I need somebody with TV production knowledge that knows classic Hollywood. Well, I'm your guy. And so I moved to Atlanta. I was there 17 years at Atlanta working at Turner Classic Movies. In 2000, Warner Brothers and Turner were all in the same company family, Time Life or Time Warner. It was Time Warner at the time. It's been through so many things I can't remember. But Time Warner owned it, and so we worked a lot with Warner Brothers, and they had this Elvis project coming up on That's the Way It Is, and they said, we think within the company, they said Tom should be involved in this because he's the Elvis guy. So I kind of got to work on it in pre-production and with Rick Schmidlin, who put the piece together, and got to work on it from the Turner side, and actually got to write when it was on TCM. It ran with a uh, video piece before it that talked about in 1970 this movie came out and now we've redone it and it contains it's the first Elvis movie that shows you the real Elvis, and because they had recut it and put a lot more performances in it and things. And so we were going to have a premiere of That's the Way It Is in Memphis. And now, again, I've met no one from Graceland. I'm working with Warner Brothers. When I would go to LA from Atlanta and work with Warner Brothers on this movie. And when I had to go to Memphis to a meeting with Graceland to do this stuff. And I'm in there with a bunch of Turner people, and there's a huge table at corporate at Graceland. And you've probably been in that room, Jeff, that giant,
Yes.
huge round table that I think they built the building around that table because I don't know how you get it in. And we're sitting around and we're talking, and there's 20 of them and 20 of us, and I'm talking about they're talking about the fact that I was the one that caught they were going to release the VHS was going to be released with a photo of um, Elvis on. It was an Elvis in a jumpsuit, but I said I caught it before it went to production. It was a jumpsuit from Elvis on tour because that was a Warner Brothers movie too. And I said that's the wrong jumpsuit. And they said to me, "Well, what does it matter? It's Elvis in a jumpsuit." And I
Oh,
says, "Well, let me ask you this: if you were going to put out a VHS of The Wizard of Oz, and it was Judy Garland and a song from Meet Me in St. Louis, don't you think people would know?" He goes, "Well, yeah, they would know." I go, "Well, the people that you want to buy this VHS are the very people that are going to know this is not the right movie."
yeah.
And so I kind of became the advisor to Warner Brothers on Elvis projects. I'm sitting in this meeting, and all of a sudden, one of the people, Todd Morgan from Graceland, who became a good friend of mine and passed away, and God rest his soul, he was a wonderful guy. The fans are missing a wonderful man that loved Elvis.
Mm.
He stood up in this meeting and said, "Hot damn, we finally have one of our guys on the inside."
Wow.
Because over the years they had been working with corporate entities and people that knew absolutely nothing about Elvis but making money off of him.
Can you imagine the way we are today if that would have slipped by
Yeah,
and you wouldn't have caught that? Today we'd be going, can you believe
yeah.
that that documentary had that?
Yeah, and so that year they had a screening of the movie in Memphis at the Orpheum Theater, and they invited me to host something at the Peabody. And then they asked if I'd, and this was not Elvis week. They said, "Well, would you be willing to come back in August and host a couple of things for us?" And I was like, "Sure, I'd love to."
What year was that?
2000,
Wow.
I think it was 2000, because 2020 was 20 years of me doing that, of hosting events.
Wow.
So and so that was it for me. And through all my stuff when I was still at TCM, I would use up vacation days to go to Graceland in August and host events, and for birthday also.
And you and I have talked about this just on the phone that we actually get paychecks that say
Yeah,
Elvis Presley Enterprises on it.
yeah.
It's crazy. It's kind of funny, Tom. You and I have talked about this when you're now involved, and we'll get into this more later with the birthplace
Hmm.
and all the things you do with EPE in Memphis. And you'll be talking to friends, and you'll say, "I can't believe I'm doing this," and, and they've told you, "Well, of course you are."
Yeah, Robert Osborne, the man who was the host of TCM, I was supposedly in the corporate structure, I was his boss, and I'm like, and he'd been on TV forever. I used to watch him on CBS Morning doing movie reviews when I was getting up to go to a TV station at 7 o'clock in the morning. And I later became somebody that worked with him, and he was a friend, a great guy. And I told him one time, I said, "Can you believe I'm doing all this stuff with?" I mean, and he goes, "Well, Tom," and I said, I'm doing this thing, and I'm hosting, and I'm talking to Jerry Schilling, and I'm talking to Priscilla. Can you believe I'm doing this?" And he said, "Of course I can, Tom. Who is better for this than you?" He says, "You've been preparing for a job that you never even knew would exist." And he was right, because I always say, if it was Bruce Springsteen, I would be a horrible host because I know less than nothing about Bruce Springsteen.
Yeah.
So I have been preparing. I like to think that I'm just a fan on stage doing an interview with a really good seat. I ask the things I know that we want to know and what we want to talk about with these people, and try to just get right to it. And over the years, they've gotten to where it went down the line. I met Jerry first, and then I got to know him, and he trusted me with Priscilla, and then Priscilla trusted me. And I think James was the first person I interviewed in the band. And I found out later he called the other guys and said, "This guy's okay. You can talk to him.
Wow.
He knows who we are. He respects Elvis. He knows who we are." And then it just kind of snowballed from there. Like I would talk to somebody, and they would go, "Oh, yeah, James called." James was kind of my agent on a lot of things. He was kind of the person making calls behind me that I didn't know about, that was warning people, "Oh, Tom Brown, he's okay. Talk to him."
That is so great. There's a talking about preparing for a job you didn't know existed. There's an article that was in my college newspaper. It was about me, and I was really starting to, make traction on the road and everything with my band. And the headline was student tries to shed Elvis image. And that and because everybody knew me as the Elvis guy.
Mhm.
I was like, well, I'm not Elvis. I don't want. I'm writing my own music. I'm trying to be my own thing or whatever. And then here we are. Everything I do is Elvis related, and all my friends are the same thing. They go, of course it is. Like they've known that since the '80s.
Yeah, imagine being the Elvis person in school in Tupelo.
Yeah, yeah. I'm in Norman, Oklahoma.
Yeah. I was working at the movie theater on Tuesday afternoon, August 16th, 1977,
Mm.
and when my phone rang, and it was in the afternoon, the matinee had already started, and the concession people were still kind of getting stuff done, kind of wrapping up for the afternoon because we were going to close and then open back for a night show. And the phone rang, and it was a friend of mine calling me saying, "Have you heard, Tommy? Have you heard the news?" And I'm like, "What do you? I don't know what you're talking about." She said, "I don't want to be the one to tell you. Just go to your car and please turn on the radio." And I could tell she was upset. And I'm like, what's going on?" And I went out to my car, my 1976 Mustang II, yellow with black leather interior and no power steering.
Sweet.
I was very strong in the shoulders because it didn't have power steering. But I went out to the car and I turned on the radio and Elvis is on. I was like, oh, and I hit a button and Elvis was on every station. And I finally heard somebody after a song say, we're just getting news in now that Elvis has passed away in Memphis. And I was like, what? What?
Hmm.
And I went inside to pick up the phone to call her back, and the phone was dead. And the phone was dead for about an hour because the lines were frying in Tupelo. And I remember walking back out and listening to the radio, trying to hear if, like, oh my gosh, oh my gosh. I'm 17, and I thought I was going to be seeing him in a couple of weeks. He was coming to Memphis, and Ms. McComb had me tickets. I was going to see him in late August. He was coming. Memphis was going to be the last stop of that tour he was leaving on. And I remember walking into the back of the theater and watching the movie that was playing, and looking at the people in the theaters, thinking, "You guys don't know yet. You people here, you don't know yet." And I went back outside and picked up the phone. It was still dead all afternoon. Got home because I just had to, rest for a while because I had to work that night. My mother had a list of people that had called saying, "Tell Tommy we're sorry we heard the news." It was like 17, 18 people that called me with condolences. So yeah, I was the Elvis person, especially in my high school. Elvis passed away the summer of what would be my senior year in high school.
Wow.
And I kind of still measure things by before 77 and after 77. It's weird. Um, Everybody talks about where they were when they heard the news. There's my story, but I think about things. I used to, in the '80s, I would always think like, oh well, Elvis didn't get to do that.
Yeah.
Elvis, oh, he would have loved this. Cell phones and computers and all that kind of stuff. Even in the '80s, things were to me. It's still there's pre 77 and there's after 77. So in 2017, we had a big Elvis week because it was the 40th anniversary of his death, and I did a lot of interviews with people, and I had a girl come up to me and say, "I just want to thank you for these conversations. Uh, Hearing about this has really helped me."
Mm.
And I said, "Oh well, thank you." She said, "Well, I had to come to grips with something that I've never met anyone else that's experienced this." And she said, "I'm an Elvis fan. I grew up, my mom listened to Elvis and I got into him." And she said, I was born August 16th, 1977.
Wow.
She said, "That's my birthday. I've lived with that day my entire life, filling out paperwork and August 16th, 1977." She said, "As an Elvis fan, it's always been sad for me to associate that with my birthday." And she said, "This year, I got to let go of all that because I heard people telling stories about the man." This is the first time she'd ever been to Graceland too.
Yeah.
And she was finally imagine having August 16th, 1977. That's your birthday.
Tom, I know, obviously, I know this, you know this, Alex knows it. A lot of the people that we know that are listening know it, but not everybody does. When you said conversations, uh, Explain what that is for those that haven't been to Memphis and haven't been to Tupelo and don't know what you do there, because it's really something every one of us envies you and maybe hates you behind your back because you get to do this and we don't. Tell us about what Conversations is.
Oh, that's not true. Some of you hate me in front of my back. Uh,
In front of my back.
Conversations is the umbrella name that Graceland uses for interviews that I do, because it's not really an interview; it's more of a conversation with these people that knew Elvis, people, family members, Lisa or Priscilla, or people that worked with him like Jerry, or musicians that worked with him like James or Glenn D and Norbert and those guys, actors, directors, co-stars. I mean, all kinds of people. So Conversations is the umbrella title. I came to the Elvis world in 2000, having done hundreds of interviews with celebrities when I was an entertainment reporter in the 90s in St. Louis primarily, but then when I lived in Los Angeles as well, and interviewing people uh, for their new movie they had coming out, and doing that either live in the radio studio in St. Louis, or interviewing comedians in the studio in St. Louis, or flying on the weekends to these junkets, film junkets, that they pay you to fly to Los Angeles and see a movie and then interview the movie stars the next day. It's a tough job. But I always thought it was a cool job until my dad one time pointed out in the 90s. He said, "Son, your car was parked at the airport for 3.5 months."
Oh no.
He had totaled up the days I had been gone
Yeah.
from St. Louis, and I would travel like 3 weekends a month, and there's really only four. And I'd leave on Friday at noon and come back at midnight on Sunday night, and I was on the radio at 6 a.m. on Monday morning. And then when I got off at 10 a.m. on Friday morning, I was going to the airport and flying to LA or New York. The good part was flying was a lot nicer back then.
Hmm.
It was easier, and the beauty was St. Louis is right in the middle. So it was 2.5 hours to Los Angeles and 2 hours to New York. And thank God for the greatest airline that ever existed, TWA. By the time I left, I was a 2 million miler on TWA. And for those people that are travelers out there, boy, don't we miss that TWA L1011. Oh, man, that was a great plane. You got steaks on it in first class with real silverware.
When was your first? Did you come up with the idea for Conversations? When was your? What was your first one? How'd that come about?
Oh, they had me come, and they knew that I could interview people, and they said, "We're doing this thing," and it might have existed before me with somebody else. I'm not really sure, uh, but yeah, I was told that's what it was, and I said, "Well, that's good because I'd rather have a conversation." You can prepare. I always prepared for interviews, and then the interview kind of naturally, the conversation naturally flows, kind of like this one. We have plans, but then we'll just go where it goes. And the person that you're interviewing doesn't know what order you've written the questions in. So you just, if you know the person's life well enough, you can just ebb and flow wherever you're going. And it's always best to talk about things that they seem interested in, as opposed to oh, let me go back and do this. No, you're going out of order. Let me go back and start here. That's not good. I interviewed one time when I first started out. I was 25 or 26. I interviewed Phil Donahue, who was a great TV host back in the day when, get this, he would have a talk show where he had an issue, and he would have someone on stage that was on one side of the issue and someone else on stage who was on the other side of the issue, and they would talk about it, and the audience would ask questions, and by the end of the show you would learn what each person believed, and you had all the facts. um, I interviewed him one time, and when we got finished, they were tearing the cameras down, and Phil Donahue is a legend, and I'm 25 years old. And he said, I've got a question for you. Have you been doing this long, Tom? And I go, no, Phil, I have not. Because he had already told me I could call him Phil by that time. So, uh, and he said, well, let me give you some pointers. And he said, number one, the greatest thing that can happen when you ask a question is silence from the other person for a few seconds, because that means you've just asked a question that's not on their prepared list of responses that everybody else asks. And if they're silent and you see them thinking, you've hit on something now. You've asked them something. They're going into their mind now, and what comes out of their mouth is going to be something that you spurred that thought. And he said, stay with that as long as they'll stay with it. Forget what's on your paper. You're going to get something that is new to them to talk about.
Mm.
And he said, just those, that's my advice to you. Take time and talk to them and try to get them to think. So in interviews that I would have 5 minutes or 10 minutes with somebody, I would do the standard questions that they were prepared for to promote their movie, but I'd always try to find something, especially with Nicolas Cage back in the 90s. So let's talk about Elvis. And his head just kind of turned. I said, I hear you're an Elvis fan. And I brought him a button or something or t-shirt from the birthplace. And it became kind of a thing that we did at junkets when I would interview Nick. He go, oh, it's Tom from Tupelo. What'd you bring me? What'd you bring me? And I'd have a pin or something that I would get from the birthplace that I would take to Nick. And again, this is in the days before Google, before Wikipedia. You had to read. I had files, but Jeff, I had files of movie stars and what they liked when I was 12.
Wow.
I was writing letters to movie stars when I was 11 and getting the addresses out of the books at the library, the resources at the library, and writing letters to Jimmy Stewart at his house on Rexford Avenue and sending him birthday cards and Christmas cards and getting Christmas cards back from Jimmy Stewart.
Mm.
When I had so many things I had mailed out that every day the mailman brought me something from somebody. It might be 6 months later, but I had pictures from actors that, I would write them at the studio, I'd write them at home. And like I said, I only had one thing picked out to do. I knew I was going to do this. And the best thing I ever did was one of my favorite actors was Jack Klugman because I love The Odd Couple. And when he was on Quincy, I wrote him a letter, and my letter was like, "I'm going to be an actor, and I'm going to do this." And the picture I got back said to Tom, "Keep at it, and I know you're going to make it. Best wishes, Jack Klugman." Right. So 30 years goes by, and I'm at TCM, and we're doing a shoot. And this was after Jack had cancer, and his throat was, his voice was rough. But we had him come to host a couple of movies, and I told him that story, and I pulled out I had the photo, and I showed him. And he looked up at me. I'm the guy in charge of this whole shoot now in my suit. And he looked up at me and he goes, "Give me a Sharpie. Get me a Sharpie." And I was like, okay. And next to where he had signed it in 1976, to Tom, I know you're going to make it, hang in there. Jack Klugman, he wrote, "See, I told you."
Wow.
Jack Klugman.
That's great.
So, yeah.
Tom, I want to go back. You talked about how an interview, you can have planned questions, but then you just have a conversation. One of my favorite stories of yours is an interview that I'm sure you had notes, I'm sure you had a question ready, and then something happened when this guy walked in, a guy by the name of Tom Hanks, who recently played Colonel Parker, as we all know. And every time I watch that movie, I watch Tom Hanks's performance and I'm more astounded by it. The more I watch this movie, I like, oh my God, he captured everything Peter Grelnick talks about in his book. Some say, oh, he kind of was a caricature. Yeah, like Colonel Parker. I mean, his performance gets even more subtle the more I watch it. But would you mind telling that Tom Hanks story? I think it's the coolest story you tell.
It was the junket for Forrest Gump. And the cool thing of doing junkets was you would fly to LA or New York or anywhere really, and interview the actors. You have seen the movie the night before, and this is in advance of the movie opening nationally. So you're seeing a movie before the public sees it because you're a news reporter. I was in St. Louis at the time, and if I did interviews with Tom Hanks, it would be on TV in St. Louis. And if my buddy Dino Lally did it, he would be in Oklahoma City. Gino would be in Milwaukee. Bobby Wygant would be in Dallas, Texas. George Pinocchio would be in San Diego, who is now in Los Angeles. And that they did it was, by markets. And so we're doing the junket for Forrest Gump. And I had the cast of the movie that I had 10-minute slots with, and I was over in the afternoon. And this was the afternoon of the OJ Bronco chase. in Los Angeles at the Four Seasons in Beverly Hills, which, if you go to the top floor and look west, you can see the ocean, of which the 405 is just before Santa Monica, before the ocean. Tom Hanks is in this room and has done 50 interviews, maybe. I'm his last interview of the day. Now, we all know this is going on out there, but inside the hotel, we've got to do these interviews. So they have a TV in the corner that everybody's watching between interviews, and then they would turn it off, and then Tom would talk about Forrest Gump with whoever was in the room. I go in. I'm exhausted because I've been working all afternoon. Tom has to be exhausted. He's done 50 plus interviews.
Right.
The crew's exhausted because they've been in there the whole day with him. And I walk in the door, and before he says hi, he goes, "Have you been watching what's going on? This is amazing. This is amazing." And I said, "Yeah, I have to." And he goes, "Okay, we have to focus. Let's talk about Forrest." Okay. And we do that. And when we get finished, they said, "Okay, that's a wrap for Mr. Hanks." He says, "Okay, turn the TV back on, turn it back on." And we look, and at the time, we see the Bronco on TV. We see the Bronco on the highway. Obviously, it's a shot from a helicopter. And then we see a shot that show all the helicopters up. And I said, "Oh my gosh, look, they just passed Washington Boulevard on the 405. That's in Culver City." And he goes, "What way are we facing? What way is this room?" We were on the top floor, and the room had a balcony, but it was all blocked off with curtain because, it needed to be dark in the room. It's late afternoon. I said, "We're facing west." He goes, "Tear that down. Let's go out there and look." And they opened it up, and the sunlight hit us. And me and Tom and the crew, it was about 4 or 5 people, go out on the balcony, and we look to the west, and just southwest, we see 20 helicopters it looked like Vietnam. I mean, it was this group of helicopters, and it was slowly working its way up the 405. And Tom is looking at the and he turns back really quick, and he looks at the TV, and he turns back, and he goes, "Look, they're there, and they're there, and they're there, and they're there." He goes, "We're going to remember this forever. We're going to remember this moment for the rest of our lives." And it's truly amazing. And so that was and I recently, I think I sent you a picture. I found the junket sheet that I had that had everybody's name on it, and it showed me last with Tom Hanks on that day. So 6 months later, I have to interview him for his next movie. And I walk in the door, and I just said, "Tom, you're not going to remember me." He goes, "Are you balcony guy?
Oh my gosh.
Are you OJ balcony guy?" And I go, "Yes." He goes, "Did I tell you we were going to remember that?"
For the rest of your life.
And so the tag to that is I told Jerry Schilling that story. And Jerry was on a private plane flying from Los Angeles to Cannes for the Cannes Film Festival. And they're on the plane for like 15 hours or something.
Yeah.
And Jerry called me later, and he goes, "Well, I can pretty much verify your balcony story." I said, "Why?" He says, "Because, after 11 hours, I run out of stuff to talk to Tom Hanks about." So I tell him, "Hey, I got this buddy that has this story, and he goes, tell him I don't remember him, but I remember that moment, and he knows way too many details to not have been there on that balcony with me. So yes, tell balcony guy hello from Tom Hanks."
I hadn't heard that part of the story yet.
Yeah.
That is great.
Yeah, Jerry told me that he had,
Oh.
because he said, "I'm sitting there, I'm like, I'm out of stuff to say. I'm just going to start." Okay, I know Tom knew Tom Hanks. He did an interview with him, so I'll tell him that story, and that'll kill 5 minutes of the 15-hour flight.
Oh my gosh.
So it's an interesting world, isn't it?
It is.